The kettle had boiled before Petunia Dursley heard the letters come through the box. 3 of them, by the sound of it, the postman's usual Tuesday delivery. She was already pouring water over the tea, already moving through the familiar routine with the ease of someone who had done it so many times that thinking was no longer required. Toast. Vernon's orange juice, pulp-free and precisely the right temperature. It was a fine morning, cool and cloudless, the particular kind of late July morning that arrived like a small compensation for all the other things summer failed to deliver. Petunia liked this hour, before the house fully woke. She liked its silence. She liked, if she was honest with herself, the half-hour or so in which she was required to be nothing more than the woman making the tea. The boy was still asleep. She knew this without needing to check. After nearly 10 years, she had learned the sounds of the house the way one learns the sounds of a body, involuntarily, without wanting to, until they became as familiar as breathing. The creak of the 3rd stair meant he was up. The soft knocking of the old pipes meant he had turned on the bathroom tap. The particular thick silence from beneath the stairs meant the cot was still. She had filed all of this away in the part of her mind she kept specifically for things she did not intend to examine, and she did not visit it by choice. She had been practicing this for years, the not thinking. She was good at it. Vernon came in from the hall with the post. He stood in the kitchen doorway going through it. The electricity bill, a circular she had been putting in the recycling for 3 months, and one other thing. An envelope that was not the electricity bill and not the circular, and that he turned over in his large hands with an expression Petunia found she could not immediately read. Not the red going to purple that meant real fury. Something older than that, something calculating. Who in blazes? Vernon said. He brought it to the table and set it down, and they both looked at it. The envelope was wrong. It was thick, almost stiff, made of a yellowish parchment that was not quite like ordinary paper. The address was written in green ink, in a handwriting that was careful and rather old-fashioned, and without meaning to. Potter the cupboard, under the stairs 4, Privet Drive, I've Little Winging, Surrey. Something moved through her. Savate moved through her. Not a thought and not a feeling, but something that lived in the space between the two, cold and immediate, the way a draught moves through a room where a window has opened somewhere. You couldn't see Vernon, she said. The word came out in a register she barely recognized as hers. Look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? He read it. She watched the color move in his face, up from the neck darkening, the familiar progression she had charted over 20 years of marriage. Pink to dark pink to a kind of brick red that meant something was happening that he could not control, and knew he could not control. They won't, he said, and his voice was very quiet, which was worse than the red. They will not be having anything to do with him. None of it. He put the letter in the pocket of his dressing gown. He ate his breakfast, standing at the counter, with one eye on the hallway, not speaking. When Harry finally came out from under the stairs, small and tousled, his black hair worse than usual, and his glasses slightly crooked, blinking at the morning the way he had, that made him look like someone who was always mildly surprised to find the world still there. She heard Vernon say nothing at all to him, which was its own kind of message. Then 2 more letters came. She hadn't heard the gate. She hadn't heard the box. They were simply there on the mat, as though they had always been there, and Vernon picked them up and tore them, and the pieces went into the kitchen bin along with the first one, all 3. And then he stood with his hands braced on the counter and his back to the room, and breathed. He told her not to discuss it with the boy. He told her the cupboard was the wrong address, now that the address was a liability, that Dudley's second bedroom was sitting there doing nothing anyway. And he said all of this quickly and quietly, standing at the kitchen sink while the torn pieces of green-inked parchment settled at the bottom of the bin. And Petunia understood what he meant without requiring him to say it plainly. Petunia said, "Yes, that's sensible." She heard herself say it. She used the voice she kept for situations that required her to agree with Vernon and move on quickly, the voice that sealed a room from the inside. Then she went to find the boy. She did not look at Harry's face when she told him. She said he was being given Dudley's second bedroom, that it was a proper room, that he was to move his things. She handed him a carrier bag. He took it without asking why. He never asked why. She had noticed over the years. He had learned at some point that questions of that kind were not answered here, and he managed his not knowing, with a patience that she found, if she were honest, rather difficult to look at directly. She left him to it. On the staircase, on her way back down, she passed the cupboard door standing open, and she did not look in. By evening, Vernon was in his study. Dudley was in front of the television. The house was quiet in the particular way. It was quiet when something had been rearranged. A new kind of silence, still settling. Petunia was standing at the kitchen bin. She had not planned to stand there. She had been washing the supper dishes, and then she had stopped washing them, and she was standing at the bin instead, and the light outside was fading, and the house smelled of washing-up liquid, and something slightly older, and the pieces of parchment were at the bottom of the bin. She stood there for quite a long time, not doing anything about it. Then she reached in. She found a corner, green ink, pale parchment, one edge torn, and brought it up and held it under the kitchen light. The address. Just the address, 4 lines, in that careful old-fashioned hand. The cupboard under the stairs, as though whoever had written it had considered how to put it, and then written it plainly anyway. She put it in the pocket of her apron. Evidence, she thought, evidence of their watching. She did not ask herself what she intended to do with evidence. That night, after Vernon's breathing had settled into its slow, deep rhythm, Petunia got up. The bedroom was dark. She went to her side of the wardrobe and moved aside the coats and the dresses until her fingers found the tin at the back, old, a little dented, painted with a pattern of small blue forget-me-nots. She had not taken it out in over a year. She carried it to the window and stood in the thin stripe of light from the street lamp outside. Inside, the tin was one letter, still in its envelope. She had opened it once, on the morning she had found it tucked against the baby on her front step, when the rest of the street was still dark and her hands had been shaking, and she had stood in the hallway reading something that quietly remade the shape of the next 15 years of her life. She knew what it said. She had always known. Dumbledore's handwriting was slanted and precise, nothing like the careful green-inked hand on today's parchment, but it hadn't mattered whose handwriting the Hogwarts letter was in. She had recognized it for what it was the moment she read the address. She unfolded the torn corner, looked at it once more in the streetlight. Then she placed it inside the tin beside Dumbledore's letter and closed the lid. She put the tin back. She smoothed the dresses across it. She got into bed and lay in the dark with Vernon sleeping beside her. In the room directly above her head, the boy was sleeping in the smallest bedroom for the first time. His cot had been moved up. Dudley's broken toys surrounded him, the surplus of a childhood that had been too well supplied on one side and not supplied at all on the other. Petunia did not think about this. She was not going to think about this. She pressed her hands flat on the duvet and breathed out, and did not think about it. She had simply not thrown the corner away. That was all. That was nothing. She had merely stood at the bin, and then she had not thrown it away. The house was quiet. The tin was in the wardrobe. The torn corner was inside the tin. She did not sleep for a long time. The letters on the second morning came in through the gaps. 12 of them, as Petunia counted later, shoved through the brass flap in the front door, pressed through the crack under the bathroom window. One of them folded twice to fit through the inch-wide gap in the back door frame. She came downstairs at 5:30 and found them already on the mat, already collected into an untidy stack by Vernon, who was in his dressing gown at the kitchen table with an expression she associated with certain kinds of emergencies. The boiler acting up, the expression of a man who had correctly identified that something was happening and had not yet decided how to manage it. 12, he said when she came in. I counted them. They found every crack in the house. Petunia looked at the letters. All of them on the same yellow parchment, all of them in the same green inked hand, or something that looked like the same hand, though 12 letters meant 12 separate copies, each one addressed to Mr. H. Potter. The smallest bedroom, 4 Privet, Drive Ive, Little Winging, Surrey. The address already corrected, she noted, already adjusted. As though whoever was sending these had been informed, overnight, that the boy had been moved, and had updated their records accordingly before the ink on the first letter was even cold. She did not say this to Vernon. I'll help you gather them up, she said. He gave her the stack to put in the sink while he found something to seal the cracks with, and Petunia stood at the kitchen sink, with 12 letters in her arms, and did something with her hands that she did not afterwards think about very directly. She counted off. 7. She set 5 in the sink. She put the 7 inside her cardigan, flat against her ribs, before Vernon came back with the sealant. She told herself, this is the threat. This is the source of it. If you want to understand a threat, you keep a record of it. She stood with her back to the kitchen while Vernon burned the 5 letters in the sink, and she held herself quite still, and the 7 letters pressed against her did not make a sound. He boarded up the gaps, after that the bathroom window latch, the back door seal, a strip of draft proofing along the bottom of the letterbox that he applied with the focused attention of a man bricking up a wall. Petunia made tea. She washed the sink where the burned parchment had left a grey smear on the enamel. She kept her cardigan on all morning. That night, she transferred the 7 letters to the tin. She did not open them. She already had, she told herself, enough information. The next morning was the egg cartons. She knew something was wrong before Vernon opened the door. She could tell by the sound of the milk float stopping, and then stopping again, and then the faint, perplexed noise that was Mr. Gibbons the milkman when something on his round had gone unexpectedly. She looked out the kitchen window and saw him walking back to his float, with the expression of someone who had delivered something he hadn't entirely understood, and on the front step were 3 egg cartons, stacked neatly. 24 letters in the egg cartons. 24 tucked in amongst the cardboard dividers where the eggs should have been, each of them addressed in the same green ink to the same boy in the same house. Vernon's face went a color Petunia had not seen before. Something past the brick red she was used to, past the purple going to alarming that she filed under serious, into something new and strange that suggested he was genuinely at a loss. He gathered up the cartons. He brought them inside. He stacked them on the kitchen table and stood there, breathing for a moment. And then he began to tear the letters up. Petunia helped. She picked up letters as they came out of the cartons and passed them across to Vernon. And in the passing, in the brief, unseen transit between the carton and Vernon's hands, she did the same thing she had done the morning before. She was more practiced now. She was quicker. 7 more letters, flat against her ribs, and she stood at the counter, folding egg cartons for recycling with her back to the room and her cardigan closed and her hands perfectly steady. She had 14 letters now. 14 complete letters, all in her possession, all still sealed, plus the torn corner from the first day. She had told herself each time it was a record, evidence of an ongoing surveillance, something a reasonable person might keep. She was becoming less certain this was the reason. That afternoon, while Vernon was in his study and Harry was making his third slow circuit of Dudley's second bedroom with the confused, careful expression of someone being shown a room they hadn't expected to be given, she picked the one addressed to the smallest bedroom, the later address. She did not want the one from before. She opened it. The envelope held 2 pieces of paper, the letter itself on a single sheet of the same yellow parchment, and a second folded sheet, which was the supply list. She set the supply list aside. She read the letter first. "Dear Mr. Crecht, Potter," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts. School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on the 1st of September. We await your owl by no later than the 31st of July. That was all. She read it again. She was waiting for something more. Some additional clause, some condition, some acknowledgement that the child receiving this letter had been living in a cupboard, that things were not quite right, that whoever was sending the letter had noted the address and found it concerning. But there was nothing else. Just the formal, cheerful acceptance, the instructions about term dates and supply lists, the request for an owl. As though this were the most ordinary correspondence in the world, as though Harry Potter were any 11-year-old anywhere, with a mother in the next room and a post-bag and an ordinary bedroom. She put the letter down and picked up the supply list. 3 sets of plain work robes, she read. 1 plain pointed hat, black, a set of protective gloves, 1 winter cloak, black, with silver fastenings, then the books, 7 of them, with titles that made no sense to her, then the equipment, 1 cauldron, pewter, standard size. 1 set of scales, 1 wand, 1 wand. The words sat on the page the same way the others did, in the same clear printed type, with no more weight than scales or a set of glass vials. She read it twice. She thought about what it meant to be given a list that included 1 wand the same way a school list included 1 notebook, 1 fountain pen, as though there were a shop, as though you walked in and asked for one. Lily had read this list. The thought arrived without warning, the way the worst thoughts always did, not crept in, but simply there, suddenly, as though it had been in the room the whole time and she had only just looked at it. Lily had received a letter, exactly like this. Lily had been 11 years old, and she had come downstairs one morning and there had been an envelope on the mat, and she had torn it open. Petunia could still hear the sound of Lily tearing envelopes, the particular enthusiastic rip she made, as though she could not bear to wait a second longer than she had to. And she had screamed, a good scream, a happy scream, and their mother had come running. And then there had been weeks of it, the excitement, the letters from the school. The visit to buy the supplies which Petunia had not been invited on, and which she had told herself she did not want to go on, while she waited at home and counted the hours. She had written to Dumbledore that autumn. She had been 12 years old, and she had been very precise about it. She had explained who she was, Lily's sister, and that she understood the school had rules about magical ability, but that she was very hard-working and quick to learn, and she was fairly certain she would manage if they would only give her a chance. She had been earnest about it. She had believed at 12 that earnestness was a form of argument, that if you explained yourself clearly enough, laid out your case without gaps, then things could be arranged. His reply had come about a week later. She had known it was his before she opened it, because the handwriting was unlike anything she had seen, slanted and precise, each letter formed with a kind of careful deliberation that her own teachers would have admired. He had written to her kindly. That was the word she always came back to. Not gently, not apologetically, kindly, as though he understood exactly what she was asking for and exactly why she was asking for it, and had thought about her specifically. Before he wrote his answer, he had told her the truth. He had told her there was no magical ability to speak of, and that this was simply how the world was, and he was sorry for it, and he hoped she would find her own particular gifts in time. She had read the letter once. She had put it somewhere. She did not intend to look again at the tin. She hadn't had the tin yet, hadn't thought of tins, a drawer, a box. She had moved it twice since then without reading it, carrying it from place to place the way one carries something that is too sharp to hold directly, keeping it only because throwing it away felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She did not know precisely where it was now, somewhere in the house. Somewhere she would not accidentally come across it. She folded Harry's letter along its original creases and set it with the others. Then she went upstairs and took the tin from the wardrobe. Inside, Dumbledore's 1981 letter in its envelope, the torn corner from the first day, and the 7 letters from yesterday. She added the 7 from today. She counted them in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 14 plus the corner, plus Dumbledore's letter. The tin was almost full, which was a thing she had not anticipated. She closed the lid. This is evidence, she thought, and the thought was already starting to feel like a habit, the way a sentence does when you've said it, enough times that you can say it without meaning very much by it. This is evidence. This is a record. I am keeping a record. She did not ask of what. She put the tin back in the wardrobe. She straightened her side of the room. She went back downstairs and started the dinner and stood at the kitchen counter while the light outside went from afternoon to evening, and the house was quiet in the way it was when everyone in it was separately occupied with their own business, and she did not think about the supply list, or about Lily, or about a drawer she hadn't opened in 20 years. She was very good at not thinking about things. The evidence was in the wardrobe. That was the important thing. That was the only thing. On Sunday morning the letters came down the chimney. They came in dozens. Petunia could not have counted them, was not going to try, spiraling down the flue in a continuous pale flutter, parchment on parchment, landing in the empty fireplace and spilling out across the hearth and onto the rug. Vernon had been standing at the kitchen doorway with his morning tea when they started, and he set the mug down on the sideboard without looking, and said, quietly, the way very large men sometimes go quiet, "Right, we're leaving." Within 10 minutes they were in the car. Petunia had not planned for what to bring, and so she brought her handbag, which was already on the hook by the door, and inside the handbag, wrapped in a spare shopping bag, was the tin. She noticed, as Vernon reversed out of the drive, that he had not locked the house. She did not say anything. The hut was on a rock. Not near the shore, not a scenic headland, an actual rock, far out at sea, accessible by a leaky rowing boat that Vernon had hired from a man on the nearest jetty, and the hut on it was barely that. One room, damp walls, a floor that was cold stone under a thin scattering of grit, and a fireplace that groaned in the wind. Vernon had found it through some method Petunia could not have reconstructed, and had seemed, in acquiring it, to believe that its sheer inaccessibility was a kind of winning. He installed Dudley on the thing in the corner that could technically be called a bed. Harry was given a blanket and the floor. Petunia put her handbag on a shelf and did not look at it. The wind off the sea made the whole structure shudder in a low, continuous way, and the rain began around 8 in the evening and did not stop. By 10 o'clock everyone had given up on conversation. By 11, they had given up on the pretense of sleep. Petunia lay on her side and listened to the rain on the roof and Vernon's breathing, and she thought about nothing, which was a thing she was practiced at, and across the room her handbag sat on its shelf, and the tin sat in the handbag, and the 14 letters sat in the tin. And she could feel all of this the way you can feel a tooth before it aches. Present, heavy, impossible to forget. She could hear the boy on the floor. He was not asleep. She could tell by his breathing, too deliberate, the careful evenness of someone lying very still in a room full of people and trying not to take up too much of it. Harry wasn't asleep. He was counting the seconds between the lightning flashes and the thunder, and then he was counting something else, something harder to name, the particular weight the last few minutes before midnight had when you were waiting for them. He had no clock. He was doing it by feel, lying on the cold stone floor with a blanket that was slightly too short, listening to the sea and the rain and the groaning of the walls. And he knew it was not rational to count like this, but he was doing it anyway. He was going to be 11. He had been 11 at midnight every year of his life, and no one at Privet Drive had ever mentioned it, and this year would be no different. The letters had stopped, for now, since there was no chimney here for them to come down, no cracks in the frame, no bathroom window to push parchment through, and the night was very dark and very cold, and he was almost 11, and nobody knew or cared. He thought about the letters. He had been trying not to, but they kept getting under the edge of everything else. Letters addressed to him, written to him, intercepted before he could touch a single one. He didn't know what they said. He didn't know who had sent them. He had seen the address on the very first one, just for a second, before Uncle Vernon snatched it away, and it had said, "The cupboard under the stairs," and he had been thinking about it since, about what it meant that someone knew that. Someone had written that down and sent it to him, and they had known exactly what kind of address it was. The thunder came at the same moment as the lightning. The door of the hut came off its hinges, not blown, not rattled loose. It was simply no longer attached to the frame, and the thing that had removed it was already in the doorway, vast, wider than the doorway, and nearly as tall, and it had to duck and turn sideways to come in, and when it came in, it shook itself the way a large dog might, and rain went everywhere. A very, very large person. Nearly twice the height of a normal man, with a wild, tangled mass of black hair, and a beard to match that covered most of his face below the eyes, which were small and black and bright, and presently looking around the hut with an expression of mild appraisal. He was carrying a pink umbrella. He took in the Dursleys and Harry on the floor, and the general state of the room, and he said, "Sorry about the door. Could do with a fire in here, couldn't it?" He pointed the pink umbrella at the empty fireplace. It lit. Then he produced a paper bag from somewhere in his enormous coat and crouched down and set it on the floor in front of Harry, who had scrambled backward against the wall and was now sitting there very still, trying to understand what he was looking at. "Squashed a bit on the way," the man said with a slightly apologetic air, "but it'll taste all right." Harry looked in the bag. Inside was a birthday cake, round chocolate, with "Happy Birthday, Harry" written on it in green icing, smudged slightly at the edges, but still perfectly legible. Harry had never had a birthday cake with his name on it before. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice came out smaller than he intended. "Rubeus Hagrid," keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. The man said it with a simple dignity, like a title he had held for a long time and was glad of. "And you're Harry Potter." He had a letter. He produced it from somewhere inside his coat, a thick envelope, yellow parchment, green ink, and held it out, and Harry took it because it seemed like the only sensible thing to do, and opened it and read it. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." His hands were not quite steady. "But I can't be. I'm not a wizard." Hagrid looked genuinely, warmly surprised. Harry. Ye didn't know. He said it without blame, the way you might say it about something that wasn't the person's fault for not knowing. "You're a wizard, born a wizard. How is it they never told you?" He looked at the Dursleys when he said this. Vernon began to speak. Hagrid turned back to Harry. He told Harry about his parents. He said their names the way a man says the names of people he loved, simply, without ceremony, with the ease of long familiarity. "Lily," he said. "James. Lily and James Potter." He said what had happened instead, and he said the name, Voldemort, the syllables landing in the small room like stones, dropped into still water. And he told Harry about the night of Halloween in 1981, and the house in Godric's Hollow, and the curse that had killed his parents, and the scar on his forehead that was the proof of what had survived. Harry listened. He sat on the floor of the hut, with the birthday cake in the bag beside him, and the letter in his hands, and he received all of it. The names, the night, the scar, the word, wizard, and it came from a very great height, and kept coming, piece by piece, each thing landing somewhere in him. Across the small room, Petunia sat in the corner with her handbag in her lap. She had not spoken since the boat. She had let Vernon speak. Vernon always spoke. He filled every silence with something bristling and certain, and she had kept herself still in the corner and watched, and when Hagrid had said the name Lily, her hands closed around the strap of the handbag. She made sure her face did not change. She was very practiced at this. But the name moved through the room the way names do when they belong to the dead, differently from how living names move, with a weight that ordinary words don't have. And it reached her in the corner the same way it reached Harry in the middle of the room, and she understood for the first time. That the letters in her handbag were about Lily as much as they were about Harry. They were what Lily's world had sent when it came looking for Lily's son. She had been thinking of them as evidence, as a record of a surveillance that threatened her household, and they were that too. But they were also this, the world her sister had lived in and died for, still reaching out across 10 years of silence to claim its own. Petunia looked at Harry's face while Hagrid told him. His face was doing the thing that faces do when someone is receiving something enormous and working very hard to receive it with dignity. He looked like someone who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting for a very long time, for someone to say his parents' names aloud. "Got it?" "Haven't ya?" Hagrid said eventually, meaning the letter. "Did any of 'em get through to Ye at all?" "We sent dozens," Vernon answered. He said it with all the authority of a man who had spent a week managing precisely this situation. No letters had been received. No letters would be received. It was entirely within his rights as the boy's legal guardian to determine what reached him, and they wanted nothing further to do with any of it, and so on, at considerable length. Hagrid ignored most of this. Petunia sat with both hands around the strap of the handbag, and her back straight, and said nothing at all. The handbag was in her lap. The tin was in the handbag. 14 letters were in the tin. When Hagrid stood to go, Harry stood with him. He collected the paper bag with the cake and folded the letter into his pocket and looked around the hut. The wet walls, the fireplace, the ruined door, still resting against the frame where Hagrid had propped it. He looked at Vernon, who had the expression of a man who had lost an argument. He hadn't known was an argument until he'd already lost it. He looked at Dudley, who was not looking at him. Then he looked at Petunia. She was sitting very upright in her corner with her handbag. She had the expression she always had, composed, giving nothing away, the expression that had sat on her face throughout the entirety of Harry's life in her house, as familiar to him as the kitchen wallpaper and the sound of the Morning Post. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the letters, about the first one, about the address written on it, in green ink, the cupboard under the stairs. Somebody had known. Somebody had written that down and sent it to him, and he had never been allowed to read it, and he wondered, briefly and without quite forming the thought, whether she had known it was coming, whether she had known all along. He did not ask. There was a very large man waiting for him in the doorway, and Hogwarts was somewhere beyond the horizon, and the night outside the hut was already clearing. He turned away from the corner where his aunt sat, and went. The house was tidier without him in it. Not that it had been untidy before. Petunia kept the house as she had always kept it, which was to say, with the kind of sustained attention that other people reserved for larger concerns, but there was a specific quality of order that settled over 4 Privet Drive in the first days of August, a completeness like a sentence that had finally found its full stop. The smallest bedroom was empty. There was no cot mattress in the upstairs hall to catch a toe on in the dark. The kitchen cupboards were exactly as she arranged them and stayed that way. She could leave a room and come back and find it unchanged, and there was a word for this that she had been trying for several days not to think, and was not going to think now. Vernon was in high spirits, which helped. He had framed Hagrid's arrival as a kind of defeat for the other side. They had come for the boy in the end, he said, and good riddance to the lot of them, and that was done. He said this several times over the course of the first week, with the air of a man who had been proven right about something important. Petunia agreed with him each time in her most agreeable voice, and cleared the table, and said nothing about the tin. She had brought it back from the hut in her handbag, and for the first 3 days she kept it where she had always kept it, at the back of her side of the wardrobe, behind the winter coats, where she did not need to look at it. On the 4th day she took it out of the wardrobe and carried it downstairs and put it on the kitchen shelf, between the old biscuit barrel and the spare set of keys. She told herself it was convenient there. Accessible. If she needed to refer to the evidence, she was still calling it evidence to herself, though the word was becoming a kind of tick, a formula rather than a description. She would not need to go all the way upstairs. This was simply a practical arrangement. Vernon did not come into the kitchen when she was not in it, and she knew it, and the tin sat on its shelf in plain view, and she went about her mornings working around it. On a Tuesday afternoon, 1 week, exactly since the first letter, she sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. She laid everything out. She had told herself she was going to count and organize, that this was a reasonable thing to do with a collection of evidence, and she did. She counted 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted all the way to 14, setting each letter down on the table in sequence, and then she set the torn corner at the end separately, and looked at what she had. There was only one natural way to order them, by address. The torn corner set the cupboard under the stairs. Every other letter, all 14, each still in its sealed envelope, the green ink precise and unwavering on each one, said the smallest bedroom. She had moved Harry on the Tuesday, the same day the first letter had arrived. She had told him he was being given Dudley's second bedroom, handed him a carrier bag for his things, and he had moved his few possessions up the stairs that afternoon. By the following Wednesday morning, 1 day later, day 2, every letter being sent to him already knew. The smallest bedroom, they all said, as though some office somewhere had updated a file the moment the cot mattress was carried up the staircase. She had moved him to stop them knowing where he slept, and they had known by the next morning. She sat with this for some time. Not the surveillance she had known about the surveillance, had known it in a cold and useful way since the Tuesday she had first read the address, but the arithmetic of what was on the table now. One address on the first scrap, the old room. 14 addresses on all the rest, the new one. The exact moment the address changed was the exact moment she had moved him, and she had moved him because the first address had frightened her, and the letters had simply corrected themselves and gone on arriving, and here they all were. She had moved him when he was 10. For 9 years and 8 months before that, the address, if anyone had sent a letter, would have been the cupboard under the stairs. She thought about whether anyone had been watching during those years too, and what they would have seen, and what, if anything, they had noted down, and whether there was a record somewhere in the same careful green ink that predated these 14 letters by a decade. She did not know, she did not think she wanted to know. She put the torn corner back. At the end of the row, she picked up one of the smallest bedroom letters and drew out the supply list from inside it. She had read this before, had read it sitting at this same table, in fact, on the second day of the siege, and had felt the world tilt in a particular direction. She read it again now. 3 sets of plain work robes. A winter cloak, black silver fastenings. The books, 7 of them, with names she had no framework for. The equipment, 1 cauldron, 1 set of brass scales, 1 telescope, 1 wand. She had read a list like this before. She had been 14. Lily had been 11 and had just received the Hogwarts letter, and the house had been loud with it for days, their mother crying happily over the breakfast table, their father taking photographs, the word witch used in every other sentence as though it were a celebration. Lily had been radiant with it, which was the word, and Petunia had not been able to look at her directly for the better part of a week. One morning Lily was at breakfast, and Petunia went upstairs to use the bathroom, and she passed Lily's open bedroom door, and on the desk, in clear sight, was the supply list. Just lying there, Petunia had stopped. She had looked at it from the doorway for a moment, then she had gone in, she had picked the list up, and read it by the window, standing very still, reading every item twice. Robes, a cauldron, a pointed hat, a wand. She had held the paper and looked at each word and understood that there was an entire world assembled on this list. Objects that presupposed a way of being in the world that she had no access to, that she was not invited to, that had been offered to her sister at 11 years old. She had stood there long enough that she could hear the voices downstairs clearly. Her mother asking Lily something about the robes, whether she would need multiple colors, and Lily's laugh. Petunia had put the supply list back in exactly the position she had found it, and walked out of the room and closed the door as quietly as she could, and gone to her own bedroom and sat on her bed with her hands in her lap for a while. She had never told anyone she had read it. She put Harry's list back into his letter. She put the letter back in its place in the row. She could burn them. She considered this sitting at the kitchen table with 14 letters and a torn corner spread out in front of her. Vernon had burned the others, burned dozens of them, without hesitation, in sinks and fireplaces and the bottom of the hut's grate. He would not know if a dozen more had been burned in the kitchen while he was at work. She had matches in the second drawer. She could have the letters gone in 15 minutes, and the tin sitting empty on the shelf, and nothing would be different from Vernon's point of view. and perhaps not very much would be different from her own. She did not burn them. She put them back in the tin, one by one, the torn corner on top, and she closed the lid. She stood up and put the tin back on the shelf. Not in the wardrobe. She put it on the shelf, visible from the table, visible from the sink, visible from anywhere in the kitchen. She stood at the window for a while and looked at the garden. The miller's hedge was overdue for a trim. The roses needed deadheading. It was a Tuesday in August, sunny and quiet, and the neighborhood had the peaceful, midsummer look of a place where nothing much was happening, and she had a tin on her shelf and 14 letters in the tin, and a question building up in the room at the back of her mind. She was not going to ask herself why she had kept them. Not today. She was aware that this was a postponement rather than a decision, that the question was not going away simply because she was declining to look at it. She had been declining to look at things for a very long time, and she was not unaware of the general pattern. The question was going to wait behind the door. She kept closed for it, and it was going to be there next week and the week after, and all through August, and at some point the door was going to have to open, just not today. The tin sat on the shelf and the garden needed attention, and Vernon would want supper at 6:30. These were the facts of her life, and they had not changed, and the morning was waiting to be got through. She went to find a secateurs. The train arrived at Hogsmeade Station close enough to midnight that the sky above the platform was entirely dark and jammed with stars, and there were boats waiting at the edge of a black lake, and Harry sat in the first one that moved and watched the castle appear around a bend in the shore. It was lit from within. Every tower, every window, the whole thing blazing against the dark, the way something very old and very certain of itself blazes, as though it had been standing there since before anyone thought to count how long things had been standing. Something happened to the space under Harry's ribs when he saw it. He wouldn't have been able to describe it if anyone had asked. It was not amazement exactly, because amazement has surprise in it, and this felt less like surprise than like recognition. Oh, the part of him said that was almost never allowed to say things, "That's where I'm going." He was sorted into Gryffindor. The hat barely touched his head. He walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down and looked up, and the ceiling of the great hall was the night sky. Actually, the night sky. Clouds moving across it in real time, stars appearing and disappearing behind them. And the 4 house tables were laden with food that had appeared from nowhere, and Harry reached for a dish of roast potatoes and thought, with a calm that surprised him, "I live here now. This is where I live." He had never lived anywhere before. Not really. He had occupied a house. He had occupied a cupboard within a house, and then a small room that had belonged to someone else. But this room, this ceiling, this table, was different, in a way he could feel, but not yet articulate. It felt like being let in. Professor McGonagall he met on the steps before the sorting with the other first years crowding behind her, and the entrance hall blazing with torchlight above them. She was tall, and wore robes so thoroughly black they seemed to absorb the light nearby, and her hair was pinned up severely, and behind her square glasses her eyes were sharp and careful, the eyes of someone who noticed things and filed them away. She looked at Harry when she reached him in the line, with an expression that was not quite neutral. It was the expression, he thought later, of someone who already knew something and was deciding how much of the knowing to show. In class, she was exacting in the way good teachers are. She did not say you must succeed, but somehow the room understood it. She demonstrated transfiguration on the first day by standing at the front of the classroom and becoming, in the space between one moment and the next, a tabby cat, a neat, brisk tabby cat with square markings around its eyes that looked, now that Harry thought about it, uncannily like glasses, and then becoming herself again. standing at the lectern with the cat's composed alertness still about her. The class had gone absolutely silent. She looked around and said crisply that they would be starting with matchsticks. Harry turned his matchstick into a needle on his third attempt. McGonagall paused beside his desk, looked at it, made a brief note on her clipboard, and moved on without saying anything. This, he was coming to understand. Professor Snape was a different experience entirely. He stood at the front of the potions classroom with his arms folded inside his robes and looked at the assembled first years with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago ceased to be impressed by anything, long black hair, a face that was pale and sharp-featured in a way that made him look like he had been drawn in pen rather than in pencil. Black eyes that moved across the class and stalked at Harry's face with an expression he couldn't decode, recognition maybe, or its cold cousin. "Potter," Snape said. His voice was quiet enough that the classroom went more silent to hear it. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry didn't know. He said so. "Let us try again," Snape said, in the tone of a man who had not expected a different answer and had only asked in order to confirm it. "Where would you look if I told you to find me a beezer?" Harry said he didn't know. "And what is the difference between monk's hood and wolfsbane?" "I don't know, sir." Apparently, Snape's gaze moved away as though Harry had already ceased to be interesting. "You are, it seems, a fame without the substance to justify it. We shall see if that changes." He sat through the rest of the lesson with the focused attention of someone who intended to answer the next question correctly, if there was one, and there wasn't, and he scraped off his desk without making a mark on the cauldron. He received no points, he lost none either, which he counted as something. The first night in his Gryffindor dormitory, Harry lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling. It was a four-poster. Heavy curtains, dark red, that he could close for privacy if he wanted to, because that was the kind of room this was, the kind where you could have privacy if you wanted it, where the door at the end of the room opened from the inside, where the bed was his and only his and had pillows on it, actual pillows, more than one. He had a trunk at the foot with a lock, a bedside table, a lamp, a window with a view of the grounds and the dark line of the forbidden forest against the sky. He was aware that this was normal, that the other four boys in the dormitory had probably had rooms like this their whole lives and found nothing remarkable about it. He lay on his back and looked at the curtains and felt the specific strangeness of having too much space after a long time of not having enough, the way you feel unsteady in a wide-open field after years of narrow corridors. He did not tell anyone in the dormitory that he had slept in a cupboard for most of his life. They talked, that first night, the easy overlapping conversation of people at the beginning of something, trading names and where are you froms and what do you thinks. And he listened more than he spoke, which was habitual. At one point, one of the others asked him what his house was like before Hogwarts, and he said it was fairly small, and they moved on. It was not a lie. It was simply one of those answers that contains a lot more than it lets out and doesn't invite further questions. He was not sure how to say the rest of it. Not because it was shameful. Exactly, or not only that, but because explaining it would require other people to react to it, and the reactions he could imagine ranged from uncomfortable pity to a kind of horror that would then need to be managed, and all of that was more complicated than the thing itself. So he said fairly small, and the conversation moved on, and he lay in his four-poster and thought about it privately. The question about the letters arrived around 2 in the morning. Hagrid had told him in the hut that the Dursleys had kept the letters. He had absorbed this as one fact among many enormous facts on a night that had been densely populated with enormous facts, and had filed it alongside the others. Now, in the quiet dormitory with everyone else asleep, the question unpacked itself. How many had there been? He tried to reconstruct what he knew. He had seen dozens coming down the chimney before Vernon had announced they were leaving. He had seen the letters that Vernon burned, in stacks more than once. He had had one brief glimpse, one before the letter was snatched, of the address on the first one, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Winging, Surrey. He lay very still and thought about that address. The cupboard under the stairs. Someone had written that down. Someone had looked at the record of where Harry Potter lived and written it out in careful green ink on a Hogwarts letter, the cupboard under the stairs, which meant they knew. The people who had sent the letters, the people who ran this school, the people who had sorted him into Gryffindor tonight, the people who had sent Hagrid on a boat to an offshore rock specifically to deliver a letter to him, had known, when they sent the letters. He could not quite work out what to do with this. He turned it over several times and could not find a way to hold it comfortably. They had known, and they had sent him a letter, and the letter said, "We are pleased to inform you," as though the address it was sent to were perfectly ordinary, as though there was nothing in the words, "the cupboard under the stairs," that required comment. He was pleased to be informed. He was at Hogwarts. He was sorted into Gryffindor, and his bed had curtains, and he was very glad to be here, but someone had written down where he slept. He pulled the curtains closed and set the thought on a shelf and went to sleep. In the second week he sent Petunia a letter. He had Hedwig. Hagrid had given her to him in Diagon Alley, a snowy white owl who lived in a cage on Harry's bedside table and regarded everyone in the dormitory with an air of quiet superiority that Harry found. The other students wrote letters home. He was trying to learn how things worked, which included how letters worked, and the only adult address he had outside Hogwarts was Privet Drive. This was not a good reason to write to Petunia. He knew it wasn't a good reason. He wrote the letter anyway. "I have arrived safely," he wrote. "Hogwarts is very large. I hope everything is fine at home." He read this back. It sounded like a letter written by someone who had learned from a book what letters were supposed to contain. He folded it and tied it to Hedwig's leg, and she flew out the window without complaint, because she was that kind of owl. He did not ask about the letters and what he had written to Petunia. He had almost asked, had held the quill over the parchment with the question half formed, but he had put it away again. He had arrived safely. He could ask later, if there was a later. If Petunia wrote back, Hedwig returned 3 days later. She came back to his dormitory bedpost in the early morning, and there was nothing attached to her leg, and she accepted a treat and went to sleep. Harry watched her for a moment. Then he went down to breakfast. She noticed it in the 3rd week of term. It was a transfiguration lesson. She had just moved the class from matchsticks to beetles, a step that sorted the attentive from the merely clever, and Potter was doing well. That part was not a surprise. He had a quality of attention she associated with only a few students in her 4 decades at Hogwarts. Not the bright, performative alertness of a child who knows it's being watched, but something quieter and more ingrained, the sustained focus of someone who has learned that overlooking details can have consequences. He was working with his head bent over the small beetle she had placed on his desk, one hand very still, concentrating. She had paused at the front to make a note in her attendance ledger, and across the room a book slid off the edge of a desk and hit the stone floor with a sharp crack. Potter's response was immediate and involuntary, and over in less than a second, a small, tight stillness, shoulders drawing up, head dropping slightly forward, hands not quite moving. As though his body had assessed the sound and braced for what might come next before his mind had fully registered what it was. Then he saw the book lying on the floor, reassessed, and went back to his beetle. He had not drawn attention to it. None of the other students had noticed. She had noticed. She made a note in the margin of her ledger, not in any column the ledger had a heading for, and she kept watching. Over the next 2 weeks, she kept a careful account without intending to, in the way that 4 decades of teaching had trained her to observe certain patterns before she understood why she was observing them. He flinched at raised voices. Not the way students flinched when she was displeased, which was a reaction to immediate cause, but a flinch that happened before she finished raising her voice, a preemptive reflex, as though his body had concluded long ago that a raised voice was in a category with other kinds of threat. When she caught herself noticing it, she was careful not to let him see her noticing. He was thin. This was not, on its own, a diagnostic fact. She had taught hundreds of thin children. But there was a quality to his thinness that was different from simply being slender, different from the uneven growth of an 11-year-old's frame. The bones of his wrists when he wrote, the way his standard-issue Hogwarts robes knew the correct size, hung from him as though they had been made for someone who was expected to be larger than he was. It was the thinness of a body that had been given less than it needed for a long time. She had seen it before, in other students, and she was well enough acquainted with what it often meant that she chose not to be hasty in her conclusions. She filed it and went on watching. At the feast, in the 2nd week, she was sitting at the head table and happened to be watching the Gryffindor first years when the serving dishes appeared. Most children reached immediately. Potter's hand went partway to a dish of roasted vegetables and then stopped, the briefest hesitation, measured and assessing, as though he were waiting to confirm that the food was meant for him before he took any. A second later, he had the spoon and was serving himself, and the moment had passed. She doubted he was aware of it. It was not a moment that seemed to him to require awareness. And there had been one other thing, the one that she had written, in the margin of her ledger twice, underlining it once. He had said in the course of an ordinary comment during class about finding a comfortable position to work in, something about a small mattress. He had said it in passing, without self-consciousness, the way a person mentions the unremarkable facts of their own life. He had moved on immediately to the rest of his sentence. He did not think he had said anything worth noting. She had thought he had said something worth noting very much. She did not visit these observations during the school day if she could help it. She had 39 years of practice at managing the border between professional concern and the kind of personal preoccupation that helped no one, and she held herself to it. But in the evenings in her own office, when the marking was done, and the fire had burned down and the castle had settled into its overnight quiet, the observations found their way back to her, and they sat alongside something she had been carrying for 10 years. On the 1st of November, 1981, she had watched a house on Privet Drive for the entire day. She had been a silver tabby cat, sitting on the garden wall in the thin autumn sun, watching the Dursleys come and go through the gap in the curtains and across the short stretch of garden between the front door and the car. She had chosen a tabby and not something less visible because she needed to stay in one place for a long time without attracting attention, and a cat on a garden wall attracted precisely no attention in a street like that. She had been there from early morning. She had watched the husband leave for work. She had watched the wife take the boy, a heavy, fair, disagreeable-looking child of perhaps 3 or 4, out to the car and come back without him, presumably to a childminder. She had watched the wife spend most of the morning in the kitchen, visible through the window, doing the things that people in houses like this did. She had watched, and she had understood, with the kind of understanding that arrives not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something she had already suspected, that this was a household where things not permitted to be spoken were still very much present. She could not have said precisely how she knew this. A cat's observation is a different kind of observation from a person's, the whole body engaged at once. But she knew it, and she knew that the woman in the kitchen was not cruel in any way that could be easily identified and named from a wall. She was simply not, in any way that mattered, good. She had gone to Dumbledore that evening. She had told him plainly and without flourish, "These are the worst sort of muggles." She had told him about the manner of the street, the quality of the household, the woman's face when she crossed her own kitchen, a face that suggested she counted everything and was satisfied only when the accounts balanced perfectly in her favor. She had said, "You cannot leave the child here." She had said it in the room, and she had meant it. And she had been very clear. He had listened. Dumbledore always listened. It was one of the things about him that made him most difficult to argue with, because he did not give you the obvious counter-argument. He gave you the patient hearing and then the quiet certainty. He had explained the bloodboard, ancient magic, Lily's sacrifice, the maternal blood kin as anchor, the protection that would seal itself to Petunia's home as long as Petunia kept that home open to the boy. He had said, "He will be safer there than anywhere else in the world." She had said, "I understand the reasoning." She had said it and meant it and gone to bed, and she had not slept especially well. She had understood the reasoning for 10 years. She had not agreed with it. These were different things, and she had kept them different things carefully, because the only alternative was to have an argument with Dumbledore that she had already had once and lost, and she was not in the habit of losing arguments. She had already acknowledged losing. But that was before a boy had sat in her classroom for 3 weeks and flinched at books falling and hesitated before touching food that was put in front of him. In the last week of October, she went to the headmaster's office. She gave him the full accounting precisely as she had compiled it. The flinch, the quality of his thinness, the way he attended to food, the specific phrase, "small mattress," delivered without any apparent awareness that it was anything but normal. She said, "I am not diagnosing anything. I am telling you what I have observed." She said, "The sum of these observations is consistent with a child who has spent a significant portion of his life in conditions of insufficient care." She did not say, "I told you so." She had never been the sort of person who said that. She filed the thought and left it filed. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment, and then reached across the desk and lifted the dish of sherbet lemons toward her. It was his pause. She had long since decided, not a dismissal, but a moment he built deliberately into difficult conversations, the way another person might close their eyes for a second or set down whatever they were holding. She declined the sweet and waited. He told her Harry was resilient. He said it with the warmth and the certainty that were his 2 most consistent qualities, and she recognized both and said nothing while he said it. She said, "I am not asking about his resilience." He looked at his hands. He said that the protection Lily's sacrifice had created was not replicable and not relocatable. Harry, at 4 Privet Drive, under Petunia Dursley's roof and Petunia Dursley's blood, was safer than Harry anywhere else. The conditions of the household were, and here he chose his words carefully, not ideal. He acknowledged this. He did not deny it. He said that this was a cost he had been aware of, and that he had judged it acceptable against what the alternative cost would have been. She said, "A cost to whom?" He said, gently, "Minerva, he is here now. He is safe." She found that she had nothing left to say in that room at that moment that she had not already said in various forms over the preceding 10 years and the preceding 30 minutes. She thanked him. She stood, she left. Her office was quiet at that hour. She sat down at her desk and pulled out the notebook she had started in September. Plain covered, no official purpose. Simply her record for situations where official channels seemed like the wrong instrument and private documentation seemed like the only responsible substitute. She wrote the date, the observations she had brought to Dumbledore, the substance of what he had told her. She wrote her own observation at the bottom, that she had said, "I understand the reasoning," which was not the same as "I accept the cost." She locked the notebook in the lower left drawer. She took out her red pen. She pulled the next stack of essays toward her. There was more of the evening left, and she was not the sort of person who let what she was feeling stand between herself and what needed to be done. She would go back to Dumbledore if there was more to bring him. She always had. The notebook would tell her when she had enough. November arrived the way it always did in little whinging. Not with the theatrical descent of autumn, but with a gradual draining of color, the sky going first from blue to gray, and then to the particular white-gray that Petunia associated with long weeks of not quite raining. The garden retreated into itself. The neighbors drew their curtains earlier. The smell of the house changed slightly, the sealed windows smell, the radiator smell, and Petunia cleaned the things that needed cleaning and cooked the things that needed cooking, and told herself she found this time of year perfectly bearable. The house was its own self, without Harry in it. She had lived in this house for 16 years, and in all of them it had never quite felt like this, a settled quiet, a completeness. Dudley claimed the television in the front room with unchallenged authority. Vernon came home from work and found everything where he left it and was satisfied repeatedly in small daily ways that added up to a general air of things being as they should. November, she thought, suited the house. She stood at the kitchen counter most mornings with her tea and looked at the tin on the shelf. She had stopped explaining it to herself in September. She had stopped saying evidence. She had moved through explanations the way you move through stages of a thing, until there are no more stages and you are simply standing with the thing itself without a name for it. The tin was on the shelf. She walked past it 10 times a day. She had nothing more to say about why. In October, she had received a letter from Harry. She had come in from the garden to find a snowy white owl on the kitchen windowsill, which she had spent a full minute looking at before concluding that the owl was, in fact, a real owl with a real letter attached to its leg. She had detached the letter with hands that were not quite steady. The owl had watched her do this with the expression of something that had never doubted its own welcome. She had opened the envelope. The letter said, "I have arrived safely. Hogwarts is very large. I hope everything is fine at home." That was all. 1 page, barely a page, in the handwriting of someone who had not written many letters, careful and slightly uneven. The letters a bit too large. She had stood at the counter and read it twice. The owl had looked at her in an interrogatory way that suggested it was available for a reply if she wished to provide one. She had opened the drawer beside the hob, where she kept things she hadn't yet decided what to do with. The takeaway menus, the appliance warranties, the birthday card from Vernon's sister, and she had put the letter in. She had held a piece of bread out to the owl, which ignored the bread, considered her for a further moment, and then left. She did not put Harry's letter in the tin. This was a decision she made without making it, in the way she made certain decisions by simply not doing the other thing, and then sometime later noting that it had become true. Harry's letter was something else, something that had not happened before, and it went in the drawer where she would not have to think about where it was. This made sense to her in November, in a way that she suspected might not make sense if she examined it in daylight. On the second Tuesday of November, Vernon was at the lodge, and Dudley was at a friend's house until 9. She had the evening. She stood in the kitchen at 6:30, looking at the tin on the shelf, and she thought, "Not yet." And then she thought about the fact that she had just used the word yet, which was not a word she had used about the tin before. She took the tin down, she sat at the kitchen table, and opened it and took everything out. The 14 letters. The torn corner from the first day. Dumbledore's letter, still in its envelope, the slanted, precise handwriting on the front that she would have known anywhere. She laid it all out on the table the way she had done in August, but it felt different now. The same objects in the same arrangement, but November had taken something out of the morning. In August logic that had made the display feel like accounting rather than what it actually was. She picked up the torn corner, the cupboard under the stairs. She had read these words 50 times in this room. She had considered them from every available angle, as evidence, as surveillance, as a letter system doing something automatic and neutral, as proof that the wizarding world tracked certain information efficiently. She had arranged them in every frame she could find, and none of the frames had been quite large enough, quite the right shape, to hold what the words were. They were simple words. Someone had written them down. Someone in Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had looked at whatever record they kept of Harry Potter's address and written the cupboard under the stairs, and had then sent an acceptance letter to it, and had then sent 11 more acceptance letters to it. She put the corner down, she got up, she went to the second drawer where she kept writing paper, plain, cream-laid paper, the kind she used for thank-you notes and letters to Dudley's school. She took out 4 sheets. She came back to the table. She put the tin to one side and the 4 sheets in front of her, and uncapped her pen. She wrote, "Dear Lily." She stopped. She looked at the words for a moment. Lily had been dead for 10 years and 3 weeks. This was not news to Petunia. She had said goodbye to it every morning for 10 years, the way you say goodbye to a thing every morning once you have decided to keep saying goodbye instead of anything else. She picked up the pen again. She wrote about the summer Lily got her Hogwarts letter. Petunia had been 14, nearly 15, and the house had been loud with it in a way that pressed on her wherever she went. Their mother had cried happy tears at the breakfast table. Their father had taken photographs. Lily had been radiant, which was the only word, and Petunia had not been able to look at her directly for nearly a week. She wrote, "I was not pleased for you. I know that now, in a way, I could not have said then. I was not pleased for you, and I could not explain to anyone in the house why this was so, without it reflecting very badly on me, so I did not explain it. I put it somewhere else. I became very good at putting things somewhere else." She wrote about the supply list she had read in secret, the morning she had walked past Lily's open bedroom door and stopped in the doorway and looked at the list on the desk and gone in. She wrote, "I stood at your window for a long time. I could hear you downstairs asking Mum about the robes. I heard you laugh. I put the list back exactly where I found it, and I went to my room and I sat on my bed, and I did not think of a single thing to do with what I was feeling. So I went down to dinner, and I helped wash up, and I went to bed." She wrote about the letter she sent to Dumbledore in the autumn. She had been precise about it. She wrote. She had explained her situation without melodrama. She was Lily's sister. She was aware of the rules regarding magical ability. She was hard-working and quick, and she was fairly certain she could manage if given the opportunity. She had believed at 12 that if you explained a thing clearly and without gaps, outcomes could be arranged. His letter had come back in about a week, His handwriting was slanted and deliberate, and he had told her the truth very kindly. He had said she was welcome to the world as it was available to her. He had wished her well. She had kept the letter in a drawer for 3 years, and then moved it twice, and now she did not know precisely where it was, only that it was somewhere in this house. And she thought sometimes that she would find it one day when she was looking for something else, and that it would still be exactly as kind and exactly as final as she remembered it. She filled 2 pages. She was on the 3rd. She wrote, "I kept the boy because you asked me to. You asked me in a letter that arrived with him on my front step in the dark, and Dumbledore wrote that the protection only worked if I took him in as my own, and I took him in because the alternative, which he also described, the warding failing, the danger of it, was too large a thing to refuse. I took him in because I understood the terms, and the terms left me no choice. I could live with. I thought that was all I owed you. I thought I had paid the debt." She stopped writing. She looked at the 3rd page. She wrote, "I kept the letters because he wrote 3 different endings and crossed them all out. The first said, 'Because I did not want to throw them away without understanding what they were.' The second said, 'Because I was afraid of what they proved, and afraid that burning them would not make the proof disappear.' The third said, 'Because I did not want Vernon to be the only person who knew.' She crossed all 3 out, Thaddeus." She sat for a while with the pen uncapped, looking at the sentence with 3 crossed-out endings. Then she wrote, "I kept the letters because someone should know." She capped the pen. She sat very still at the kitchen table, with the 3 pages in front of her, and the 14 letters and the torn corner spread to one side. The house was quiet. The kitchen clock ticked. The radiator clicked in the way it had been clicking for 7 years. It was 7:45 on a Tuesday evening in November. She folded the 3 pages. She did not fold them into an envelope. She got up and put them in the bin. She stood at the kitchen sink for a moment with the taps off, not looking at anything in particular. She was aware that she had written the sentence and that putting it in the bin had not unwritten it. She was aware that she had been pretending for 10 years. She could feel with some precision now the shape and extent of the pretending, and that she had stopped pretending when she wrote the sentence, and could not go back to pretending now without knowing she was doing it. She turned the cold tap on. She washed her hands. She turned it off. She went back to the table and put the letters back in the tin, all 14, plus the corner. She closed the lid. She put the tin back on the shelf. She looked at it on the shelf for a moment. She did not know yet what she was going to do with the letters. But the word "yet" was there, and it had not been there before, and she could feel its weight with some exactness. Now that she was no longer looking away from it, she went to find something useful to do with the rest of the evening. The castle began emptying on the last day of term, and Harry stood in the entrance hall and watched it happen. Students came down from their dormitories in 2s and 3s, with trunks and bird cages and owls, and the noise in the corridors had a different quality than usual, excited, hurried, the noise of people with somewhere to be, and then the coaches came, and by late afternoon the entrance hall was quiet, and the portraits had stopped pretending to be busy, and the suits of armor had returned to their usual preoccupied stillness. Harry went back upstairs. The dormitory had 5 beds, and only his was occupied. He sat on it for a while and listened to the castle settle around him. He had stayed because there was nowhere to go. He had written to Petunia in October, and she had not replied, and writing again to ask if he was welcome back at Privet Drive for a fortnight seemed like exactly the kind of question that would produce either no answer or an answer he did not want. He had not written. He had put his name down on the form that asked who was remaining for the holidays, and that he was remaining for the holidays. He had more of Hogwarts to himself than usual, which had seemed like a thing to feel reasonably good about. And then December did something he had not expected. He woke on Christmas morning to a stack of presents at the foot of his bed. He sat up and looked at them, and for a moment he could not move, because he had not understood until that moment that presents would appear at the foot of his bed at Christmas, that this was a thing that happened here, and that he would be included in it. He had understood it intellectually. He had known people at Hogwarts for 3 months now. He was not without a basic comprehension of how Christmas worked, but he had not understood it in his body, which had been at 4 Privet Drive for 10 Christmases. His body knew that December was the time of year when the house smelled of mince pies he had been asked to help make, and was not permitted to eat. His body knew that Christmas morning meant Dudley's pile, and not his. His body had not caught up with the presents at the foot of the bed. He got up, he sat on the floor, and he opened them one by one. There was an emerald green jumper, hand-knitted, thick, wonderfully soft, with a large golden H on the front, from the mother of a red-haired boy he had met on the train, who had apparently decided that Harry counted as someone to knit for. There was a small wooden flute from Hagrid, clumsily made and sounding like it knew it when he blew into it, but the thought of Hagrid making it was clear in every irregular note. There was a 50-pence piece in an envelope with no message, from Privet Drive, which he put aside, and there was one other thing, a long, silver-grey cloak, wrapped in paper, with a note attached that said, "Only use it well." He held it in his hands for a long time. When he put it on, he disappeared entirely. He stood in the dormitory with his hands out in front of him, where his hands should have been, and couldn't see them, and he thought, all right then. He went down to the Christmas feast. The great hall was decorated in the way Hogwarts had of doing things that made you feel as though the thing had always been exactly this way and would not be improved by any adjustment. 12 enormous Christmas trees, candles, streamers in the house colors, the enchanted ceiling doing something complicated with snow, the long tables reduced to just the one, and the teachers and the handful of remaining students ranged along it in a way that felt unexpectedly like a family. Not his family, or not any family he had direct experience of, but the abstract idea of family that he had assembled over 11 years from other people's houses and other people's conversations, and the general sense that there was a thing he had been missing without being able to name its shape. He ate. He ate a great deal. He had learned by now that food at Hogwarts was reliable. It appeared at meals, it was consistently there, it could be counted on, but the feast was something beyond reliable. It was extravagant in a specifically chosen way, as though whoever had planned it had thought these people should have more than enough, and had meant it. He ate roast potatoes and goose, and more roast potatoes, and something he could not identify but which tasted like Christmas was supposed to taste. He had a large piece of pudding. He accepted seconds. He had not written to Petunia at Christmas. He had thought about it briefly, and had decided not to. She had not replied to October. She had not replied to the owl he had sent in September, saying he had arrived safely, and she had not replied to October, and he had been sitting with the absence of replies in a part of himself that he had assigned to that particular problem, which was a small part. He was not going to write to her at Christmas to find out if she also didn't reply to Christmas. This was the logic he had applied, and it seemed to him sound. He went to bed full and warm, and he lay in the dormitory with the other 4 beds empty and the fire in the common room below him still going. And he looked at the ceiling of his 4-poster, the familiar red of the inside of the curtains, the familiar pattern of the canopy, and he thought about nothing in particular for a while. Then he thought about the letters. He had been doing this more often than he intended, in the way that things you have decided to leave alone have of surfacing anyway in quiet moments, the letters addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. How many? Dozens, Hagrid had said, though Harry had lost count of the ones that came down the chimney on Sunday morning before Vernon announced they were leaving. He'd had no chance to count. He'd barely had a chance to see them before the car and the rock in the sea, and then Hagrid and then the rest of it, all happening in a rush that he was still 4 months later. Sorting through, he had seen the address on the very first one. He had been standing at the hall table when Vernon brought it in from the post, and for 1 second, before Vernon's hand closed around it, he had read, Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. 1 second, then it was gone. And he had spent the 4 months since then thinking about those words. Not constantly, not dramatically, but the way you think about a splinter after it's in. You don't think about it all the time, but it's always there when you turn your attention inward. Someone had written that address down. This was the part that kept arriving with a different weight each time he thought about it. He had been lying in his bed since September. His bed was here, this four-poster, with its dark red curtains and its proper mattress and its view of the grounds through the window. And the school that had given him this bed had also, before it gave him the bed, sent letters to a cupboard. The same institution, the same green ink. We are pleased to inform you, beginning with the address, the cupboard under the stairs, as though the address were not itself information. He counted on his fingers in the dark. 1 letter arrived by post. The next day there were 12, shoved through cracks and gaps. Day 3, 24 in egg cartons. Day 4, enough to fill a chimney at minimum, 37. He had not been permitted to touch a single one. He was aware, lying in the dark in his warm four-poster, that this was a strange enough fact to warrant more feeling than he was currently having about it. He wasn't sure why he wasn't having more feeling about it. He thought perhaps he had not finished thinking his way into it yet. He had been putting it off, not out of cowardice exactly, more out of a sense that once you looked at a thing directly, it became permanently true in a way that it wasn't quite while you were still approaching it. 37 letters, minimum. To a cupboard. From this school, he counted again on his fingers just to be sure of the arithmetic, which checked out. He found the mirror on the 3rd day of the holidays. He had put on the invisible cloak and gone walking at night, because the castle was quiet, and the cloak made it possible, and he was 11 years old, and there was an entire Hogwarts to explore without anyone in it to tell him not to. He went a long way. He found a room he had never been in, on a corridor he had never walked, behind a door that had no particular distinguishing feature. Inside, against the far wall, was the largest mirror he had ever seen. It was taller than the ceiling should have allowed. Gold lettering ran around its frame, which he did not at first stop to read. He stood in front of it and looked at his reflection. But his reflection was not alone. His reflection was standing in the middle of a crowd of people, a large crowd, jostling slightly, faces turned toward him. And the crowd was not there when he turned around to check. He turned back. There was the crowd again. All of them looking at him. All of them, he realized slowly, looking at him the way people look when they are glad to see someone. He looked at the people nearest him. There was a woman standing just behind his reflected self, slightly to the left, with red hair and green eyes, his eyes. She was smiling at him, and her smile had in it something he did not have a word for, and had not previously received from any adult, and he stood in front of the mirror for a long time without moving. He went back the next night, and the night after that. He could have stayed in front of it for hours. He understood, somewhere underneath the part of him that very much wanted to stay, that this was not healthy, that you could not live in front of a mirror that showed you what you wanted most, that it was a kind of drain on something, but the woman with the red hair and his green eyes was there every time, and the man beside her with the messy dark hair and the glasses, and they were always glad to see him, and the rest of his waking life was fine and warm and better than anything he had known for 11 years. But it was not this. He stopped going on the 5th night because he had been going to go and had sat on the edge of his bed instead and reasoned himself out of it, which cost him something but which he judged to be the correct decision. He sat on the bed for a while with the cloak folded in his lap, and he thought about the woman with his eyes, and he thought about the letters in the tin he imagined Petunia still had somewhere, and he thought about how much of his history was things he had not been allowed to know. On the 31st of December, he got out a small notebook and wrote on the inside cover, how many letters were there? He underlined it twice. He looked at it. He thought, in January, I will send Hedwig and ask her directly, and we will see. He put the notebook in the drawer of his bedside table. Through the window, the grounds were dark and still, the first snow of the winter beginning to come down. He watched it for a while, and then he got into bed and pulled the curtains around him and went to sleep. The year turned over while he was sleeping. He woke up in January. He wrote the letter on the 4th of January in the dormitory after breakfast, before the rest of his year had fully unpacked from the holidays and the corridors had filled again with noise. He had been carrying the notebook with the underlined question since New Year's Eve, and he had been waiting, he realized, for term to start again, waiting for the ordinary shape of things to resume around him, so that when he did this, it would be contained within the ordinary shape of things, and not something he had done alone in an empty castle with too much time to think. He got out a piece of parchment. He dipped his quill. He wrote, how many letters were there? 1 line. He read it back. It was the question, which was the right thing to have on the paper. He could have written more. There were several other questions he had been filing in the same room as this one, but this was the question that needed answering first. And he had learned by now that writing Petunia more than one question at a time was not strategically sound. He folded the parchment. He addressed it to the only adult address he had outside Hogwarts. He went to wake Hedwig. She was in the dormitory on her stand, asleep in the way owls slept, one eye slightly open. He gave her the letter, and she took it with the dignified resignation of an owl who had been expecting something of this kind. He carried her to the window, and she stepped onto the sill, considered the January air for a moment, and launched herself out without further comment. He watched her until she was a white speck, and then not even that. He went to Transfiguration. He ate dinner. He went to potions, which he survived. He went to bed. He waited. Petunia was at the kitchen sink on a Tuesday morning when the owl arrived. January had come in the way it always did, grey and hard-edged, the trees stripped bare, the garden frost-stiff, and requiring nothing from her for weeks. She had been going through December in the way she went through most things, task by task, surface by surface, the clean routine of the house as a kind of anchor. The tin was still on the shelf. She had looked at it from the sink every morning and had not moved it. The owl landed on the outside windowsill with a small thud and looked at her through the glass with the deliberate attentiveness of something that knew it had been noticed and was content to wait. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She opened the window. The owl extended its leg. She detached the small roll of parchment from it and unrolled it. 1 line. 1 question. In handwriting, she recognized from October. How many letters were there? She read it twice. She looked up from the parchment at the owl, which was still on the sill, feathers slightly ruffled against the cold, watching her with the patient certainty of something that had already decided it was not leaving without a reply. She looked at the tin on the shelf. She had been waiting, she understood, for him to ask. She understood this the moment she understood it, without preamble, as though it had been true for months, and she had simply not been in the right position to see it. She had been sitting with the word yet since November, and yet had moved very slowly toward something, and that something was this morning and this owl and this question written in one careful line. The owl could not leave without a reply. That was the thing about owls. They did not take no for an answer the way a letter in a letter box did. She put the letter on the counter. She went to the shelf. She took the tin down, set it on the kitchen table. She opened it inside, Dumbledore's 1981 letter in its envelope, the slanted handwriting on the front that she had known for 10 years. The 14 Hogwarts letters, still in their envelopes. The torn corner. She took everything out and arranged it on the table. She looked at it. She picked up Dumbledore's letter and held it for a moment. His handwriting faced her. The careful, deliberate letters, the slant she would have known anywhere. She had read this letter once, standing in a cold hallway in the dark, with the baby on the floor beside her, shaking. She had not read it since. She knew what it said. She was not going to send it. She put it back in the tin. She looked at what was left on the table, 14 envelopes, and a torn corner of a 15th. She picked up the torn corner and turned it over. The cupboard under the stairs. She held it with 2 fingers. She put it down on top of the stack of envelopes. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table on either side of the pile, not doing anything, just sitting with the fact of what she was about to do. She was not going to write a note. She had considered this during the sitting, and she could not think of a single sentence she could write that was both honest and bearable to write. He had asked how many. The answer was 14, plus the corner. She could give him the answer without writing it down. She could give him the answer by being the kind of person who put the letters in the pile and tied the pile to the owl's leg. And that was the kind of person she was apparently going to be today. She found a piece of string in the utility drawer. She bundled the 14 envelopes and the torn corner together. She lined them up neatly, which was a habit she could not seem to set aside even at moments like this, and tied the string around the bundle 3 times. She picked it up. She went back to the window. The owl had not moved. It was watching her with an expression that did not precisely contain impatience, but that made her feel that impatience was available to it if needed. She held out the bundle. The owl examined it for a moment, appearing to assess its weight and the logistics of the leg attachment, and then allowed her to fasten it. She double-checked the string. She stepped back. The owl took off. It cleared the garden wall and turned south, white against the gray January sky, and it was gone. She stood at the open window for a moment with the cold coming in. Then she closed it. She took the tin, Dumbledore's letter inside it, the lid on, and she carried it upstairs and put it at the back of her side of the wardrobe, behind the coats, where she had kept it for 10 years before she moved it to the shelf. The shelf was bare. She looked at the shelf for a moment from across the kitchen. She thought she might put a vase there, something with dried flowers, or just the blue glass vase she had never found the right spot for. She would think about that later. She washed the tin. First, she stood at the sink and ran warm water into it, and wiped it out with the cloth, and rinsed it, and set it on the drying rack. This was not a logical thing to do. The tin was not dirty, but it had a kind of ritual sense to it, the way certain practical acts take on weight when they happen at the end of something. And she let herself have it. She washed the tin and put it on the rack, and then put the cloth to soak and dried her hands. She did not regret having sent the letters. She checked, standing at the sink, ran the check deliberately in the manner of someone who wanted an accurate accounting, and found nothing there that registered as regret. This was the most surprising thing about the entire morning, and possibly about the preceding 6 months. Hedwig came back on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of January. Harry had come up from dinner, and she was there, on the bedpost, her leg unburdened, watching him cross the room with no particular urgency. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her leg. The bundle she carried was considerable. He could see the white envelopes even before he was close enough to untie them, and his hands were steady when he worked the string loose, but only technically. There were 14 envelopes. He counted them on the bedspread, moving each one to the other side. As he counted, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 14. He counted them again. 14. There was a torn piece of parchment also, a corner, a fragment, with 4 lines of green ink on one side. He read the first 2 lines. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. He laid the corner down. He picked up the first full envelope. The address began. The smallest bedroom. He set it beside the corner, to the left. He went through the rest, all 14. He laid them out in 2 groups on the bedspread, the corner alone on the right, the 14 envelopes in a row on the left, and looked at what he had. He did not go down to dinner. He had already had dinner, but he would not have gone anyway. He sat cross-legged on the bed and looked at the 2 groups and thought about what they meant in terms of sequence. The corner was from the letter that had arrived when his address was the cupboard. The 14 letters had been addressed to the bedroom. She had moved him out of the cupboard the same day the first letter arrived, and the letters had updated themselves overnight, and then the siege had lasted 3 more days after that, 12 letters the next day, 2 dozen in egg cartons, then the chimney, and she had kept 14 of them, plus the corner of the first one. There was no note. He had turned the bundle over twice looking for one. He read the address on the torn corner again. The cupboard under the stairs. The handwriting was the same as on the acceptance letter he had read on the floor of the hut on the rock. The same green ink, the same careful lettering. The same office, the same quill, the same system that had sent him dozens of letters had addressed the first ones to the cupboard and the later ones to the bedroom, and had at no point done anything with the information that the first address contained except send more letters to a different address when the first address changed. He counted the letters a 3rd time, 14. He asked himself the question he had been approaching from the side since July. Did they know? Then he asked himself why he was asking, because the answer was written down. He was holding the answer in his hands. They had known. The quill or the book or whatever system Hogwarts used to generate its letters had written the cupboard under the stairs and sent the letter, and that was what knowing looked like from the inside. A piece of parchment with an address on it, delivered by the regular morning post, as though the address were ordinary. He sat with this for a while. He did not cry. He did not rage, which surprised him slightly. He had thought, in the abstract, that when he finally knew the full shape of the thing, he would feel something that was larger and louder than this. What he felt instead was something quiet and very heavy, the weight of something that had always been true and was simply now confirmed. He had slept in a cupboard. The school that gave him everything he now had known about the cupboard. These 2 facts sat beside each other in his chest without resolving into anything that had a simple name. He gathered the envelopes back into their bundle. He wrapped the torn corner inside the bundle so it would not get lost. He tied the string back around them. He put the bundle in the bottom of his trunk, beneath his winter robes, where he would know it was there without having to look at it every morning. He closed the lid of the trunk. He sat on the bed and looked at the window where the January dark had come down fully, and there was nothing to see but the reflection of his own room. He looked at his reflection for a moment. Then he reached for his transfiguration notes because there was an essay due on Friday, and it was not going to write itself. He wrote to Petunia on the Friday after Hedwig came back. He had sat with the question for a day and a half, which was the appropriate amount of time, he thought, to sit with a question before deciding it was the right one to ask. There were other questions available. There were several other questions that had been waiting behind the first one, and were now pressing forward with the self-importance of questions that believe their turn has come. He wrote just the one. Why did you keep them? He addressed it and gave it to Hedwig and told her she could come back with whatever Petunia sent, or without anything if Petunia sent nothing. Either was fine. Hedwig looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested she did not quite believe his equanimity on this point, and then she took the letter and flew out the window. He went to breakfast. He did not tell anyone about the letters. This was a decision that had not required very much deciding. He had the 14 envelopes in the bottom of his trunk and a question about them that was still resolving itself into whatever it was going to become. And in the meantime he had classes and meals and the normal business of being 11 years old and in his first year at Hogwarts, and that was enough to be going on with. He was not sure, in any case, how he would say it. He had spent the previous 5 months at this school, carefully not mentioning the cupboard, not because it was shameful, precisely, but because it was complicated, because explaining it required the other person to have a reaction. And then he would have to manage their reaction while also managing his own experience of the thing, which seemed like more work than the thing itself. He had managed the thing for 11 years by not making it into a problem that required other people's involvement. He was not quite ready to change that. What he had instead was the knowledge, which was a different kind of having. He would be sitting in potions copying an ingredient list, and from somewhere underneath the copying the knowledge would surface. 14 letters, 1 torn corner, the address, the question of what it meant that someone had written it down. He would be eating lunch, and it would be there. He would be in Transfiguration, watching a matchstick, and it would be there, underneath the watching. It was not unpleasant exactly. It was more like the sensation of something finally resolved, a problem whose parameters were now fully mapped, even if the solution was still unclear. He knew what had happened. He had been keeping letters from himself for months, telling himself the question was still open. The question was now answered. The letters had addressed him to a cupboard. He had lived in the cupboard. These were the facts, and they were his to have. 2 weeks passed. Hedwig did not return. He had not expected her to return quickly. During those 2 weeks, he found that the knowledge was doing something to the way he moved through the castle. Not dramatically. No one who knew him would have noticed a change, but it was there, a slight private alteration of his relationship to the spaces he was in. He would lie in his 4-poster bed and notice again the door that opened from the inside. He would walk into the great hall for dinner and notice the food that appeared reliably at mealtimes. He would walk into McGonagall's classroom and notice the high ceilings and the windows and the room's general assumption that the people sitting in it were entitled to be there. He kept noticing these things without making too much of the noticing. He was just noting the facts of the place in which he now lived, against the facts of the place in which he had previously lived. He was doing arithmetic. He went to McGonagall's office on a Tuesday afternoon in early February, 2 weeks and 3 days after Hedwig had brought the bundle back. He had decided to go the previous Thursday and had waited 4 days, because the waiting gave him the opportunity to undo the decision if he changed his mind. And he had not changed his mind. He was not going to ask her to do anything. He had been careful about this in his thinking. He had examined what he was doing from the outside and made sure he was clear about it. He was going to show McGonagall 2 envelopes, because the envelopes contained information that an adult at this school probably ought to have. He was not asking for rescue. He was not reporting anything in a formal sense. He was doing the same thing he had done with the question in his notebook. He was writing something down, making it real outside of himself, putting it somewhere it could be known. He waited after Transfiguration until the other students had filed out. She was at the front of the classroom writing something on a notepad, and she looked up when she registered that he was still there. "Potter, Professor. Busser, could I? I have something I'd like you to look at. It won't take long." She regarded him for a moment with the quality of attention he had come to recognize from her class. Not the surface-level notice of a teacher registering that a student has spoken, but the deeper, more considered attention of someone who was actually looking at what was in front of them. She set down her pen. "Come to my office." Her office was down the corridor from the classroom, neat, precise, the desk arranged with the thoroughness of someone for whom disorder was a choice they had decided not to make. A fire in the grate. A row of books along one wall, organized by some system he couldn't quite pass. 2 chairs in front of the desk. She gestured him to one and sat in the other, rather than behind the desk, which he registered as a deliberate choice and appreciated without being able to say why exactly. He reached into his bag and took out the 2 envelopes. He had separated them from the rest of the bundle the previous Thursday when he had decided he was doing this, pulled 2 envelopes from the bottom of his trunk, one addressed to the cupboard under the stairs, and one addressed to the smallest bedroom. Slightly softened from 4 days of proximity, he held them out. She took them, she looked at the first one, the address, the green ink, the same careful lettering he knew from the acceptance letter. Her face was not a face that gave a great deal away in ordinary circumstances. He watched it carefully anyway. She read the address on the first envelope. She read the address on the second. She looked at him over the top of them. Her expression did not change. He had expected something. Not quite surprise, because she was not the kind of person who showed surprise easily, but some small shift in the arrangement of her face, a line, a tightening, some acknowledgement that the information she was holding was new to her. There was nothing. Her face was exactly as composed as it had been when she took the envelopes, and the composure was not the composure of someone receiving neutral information. He understood in that moment, with the specific, cold precision that had been his primary thinking instrument for 11 years, that this was not news to her. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the general shape of the thing. The general shape of his life at Privet Drive. She had been looking at him since September, and she had been building a picture, and the envelopes were not the first strokes of that picture, but the ones that made the rest of it readable. This was worse than if her expression had changed. "These were addressed to you?" she said. "Yes, there were others. 14 total, plus this corner. Someone kept them. I got them in January." She turned the first envelope over in her hands. She said, "How long did you sleep in that room, Potter?" He had known she would not ask whether he had slept there. The address settled that. She was asking the duration, the number, the scope of it. He said, "Most of my life, until, just before the letters started coming, they moved me." When the first one arrived, she said nothing for a moment. She nodded once. A small, precise movement. She turned the envelopes over again and then held them back out to him. He took them, she said. "I would like to speak with you again in a few days, if you don't object. Not today." "I'd like to. Think. First." "All right," he said. "Thank you for showing me." He had not been thanked for showing something before in quite that way, and he did not know entirely what to do with it, so he said, "You're welcome," and stood up and went back to the corridor. And by the time he reached the stairs, he was already thinking about what he was having for dinner and whether he'd be able to finish the charms essay before Thursday, because the letters were in his bag and they were his, and he had done what he had come to do. She sat for a few minutes after the door closed. She had the habit, in difficult moments, of not making any movement until she was certain she knew what the movement was for. It was a habit built over 39 years in a school full of children who were watching their teachers for cues about how to respond to things, and it had become so ingrained that she held still now in her empty office with no students present. She sat and looked at the fire and thought. He had said most of his life, until just before the letters arrived. She had put a note in her ledger in October about a small mattress. She had put a note in the same ledger about the quality of his attention in class, the measured relationship with food, the flinch at raised voices. She had taken these notes to Dumbledore in October, and Dumbledore had given her the blood wart, and she had said, "I understand the reasoning," and left. The envelopes were not new information. They were the arithmetic made visible. Someone had written down where he slept and sent the letters there, and the address on the letters was a record, and she was now in possession of 2 pieces of that record. She opened the lower left drawer of her desk. She took out the plain-covered notebook. She opened it to the most recent entry, which was dated October, and which she had added to twice since then. She wrote today's date. She wrote the 2 addresses in full, exactly as they had appeared on the envelopes. She wrote the duration, in his words, most of his life. Until just before the letters arrived. She looked at what she had written. She closed the notebook. She locked the drawer. Then she picked up her pen, because there were essays to mark, and there was always something else that needed doing, and she was not going to sit in her office not working when there was work in front of her. But she marked the essays with a different quality of attention than she usually brought to them, a tighter focus, a deliberateness, in the way she always worked when she was holding something she had not yet decided what to do with. She was building toward something. The notebook would tell her when she had enough. She had prepared what she was going to say. This was not unusual for her. She had been preparing things she was going to say for 55 years and had found the practice reliable, but on this occasion the preparation had taken longer than it normally did, because the thing she was going to say had a particular shape that required exactness. And she had learned over a very long acquaintance that if you were not exact with Albus Dumbledore, he had a gift for finding the gap and moving himself gently into it, and the conversation would end, not where you had intended to end it, but somewhere slightly warmer and more comfortable and wrong. She had been thinking about this since October. She had been thinking about it with more precision since the Tuesday, 2 weeks ago, when Harry Potter had handed her 2 envelopes, and she had read the addresses and understood that the picture she had been building in her ledger margins since September had a shape she had already suspected. She went to the headmaster's office on a Thursday morning in mid-February, when she had a gap between transfiguration and a second-year supervision, which gave her 45 minutes. She told herself 45 minutes was sufficient. She told herself she would not need more than that if she was precise. The gargoyle moved aside for her. She went up the spiral stairs. She knocked and heard his voice and went in. He was at his desk when she entered, which was where he usually was at this hour. The office was warm, lit by a combination of winter sunlight from the high windows and the various lights of the instruments that lined the shelves. Several portraits of previous headmasters were watching with the attentive neutrality of people who knew they were not supposed to visibly listen. Fawkes was on his perch, copper and gold in the morning light. She crossed the room and placed the 2 envelopes on the center of his desk. She did not sit. Dumbledore looked at the envelopes. He looked up at her. He did not ask what they were, which told her that some part of his mind had already understood what they were going to be about. Even before he read them, he picked up the first one. He read the address. He set it down and picked up the second. He read that address. He set it beside the first. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her, and in his expression was something she had very rarely seen there. Not surprise, not deflection, not the gentle warmth he deployed to manage conversations that were going somewhere he found inconvenient. Something quieter than any of those. She said, the letter generation system at this school knew where that child slept. It recorded his address as the cupboard under the stairs, and it sent letters there, and he received none of them because the Dursleys intercepted everyone. I want to know whether you were aware of the address when the letters were going out, and I want to know what you did with that information. She had said this exactly as she had prepared it. No emphasis misplaced, no clause she would want back. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that the fire made a sound, and one of the instruments on the shelves emitted a small, thoughtful puff of silver smoke. Then he opened the lower right drawer of his desk and took out a folder, and from the folder he took a letter which he set on top of the envelopes. His own letter. She could see his handwriting on the pages, slanted and deliberate, the same hand she had seen on memos and announcements for 39 years. He said, "This is the letter I sent to Petunia Dursley. On the night of the 1st of November, 1981, he turned to a page toward the back and read aloud the relevant passage which she had not previously heard in full. The mechanics of the blood ward, the requirement that Petunia take Harry into her home and hold him there as her own, the word anchor. The assurance that the protection would hold as long as the Dursley house remained Harry's home, as long as Petunia maintained the acceptance he was asking of her. He read it in his usual voice, which did not waver. He set the letter down. He said, "I did not specify the conditions of Harry's care in that letter. I asked Petunia for acceptance. I trusted." He stopped, and she noted the stop with the precision. She noted everything. I trusted that acceptance, as I had asked for it, would encompass what any reasonable interpretation of the word should encompass. It did not. I was aware of the address on the letters. I assumed the address was the address of an ordinary bedroom. He looked at the first envelope again. I assumed it because I wished to assume it, I think. Not because I had evidence of it. The room was quiet. Fawkes shifted on his perch with a small, liquid sound. She said, "I told you," she said it simply, without heat, without the particular quality of satisfaction that accompanies being right when someone else was wrong. She said it the way she would state a date or a fact, as the thing that was true and needed to be said so that it was in the record. On the 1st of November 1981, I sat on the wall of that house for 12 hours as a cat, and I told you they were the worst sort of muggles, and I told you I did not think you should leave the child with them, and you explained the blood ward, and you left him with them. I'm not saying I was correct about everything. I am saying I said something and I had the right to say something, and I said it." Dumbledore looked at her for a moment. He said, quietly, "You had every right. You were correct." She said, "I am going to put a note in my file, not an official complaint. I am aware that an official complaint at this stage has consequences I am not prepared to set in motion with everything else he is facing this year. A private record that I made this observation and brought it here, and that you acknowledged it." She looked at him. "I want you to know I am doing that." He said, "Yes, I think you should." She did not feel precisely what she had expected to feel. She had expected something resolving, the relief of having said the unsaid thing to the person who needed to hear it, the satisfaction of the account being made complete. What she felt instead was tiredness. Old tiredness, The kind that had been there since November 1981 and had been waiting under everything else for 30 years and had never quite gone away. She had always been going to say it. Now it was said, and it was not a release so much as a setting down. She left the 2 envelopes on his desk. She did not pick them up. They were his problem now, which was what she had intended them to be when she placed them there. She thanked him, which was habit, and she went back down the spiral stairs and out through the stone corridor and to her next class. At Privet Drive, Petunia had been sitting with the question for 3 weeks. Why did you keep them? She had received Harry's second owl in late January, the same white owl, landing on the windowsill again with the same expectant patience, as though it had been to this window often enough to have developed opinions about it. She had detached the letter. She had read the line. She had fed the owl a corner of bread and watched it take off. And then she had put the letter in the drawer beside the hob and gone back to what she was doing, which was making dinner. Because dinner needed making, regardless of the letters under discussion. She had known the question was coming. She had sent the letters without a note, precisely because she had known the question was coming, and had judged that the answer was more likely to be heard if he had the letters in his hands before she tried to give it. He had the letters now. He had sent the question. She owed him an answer. The answering was the difficulty. She had written 3 starts and thrown them all away. The first said, I kept them because they were addressed to you, and you did not receive a single thing that was addressed to you in this house, and I thought someone should. She read this back and found it more honest than she was quite comfortable with, which was not a criterion she had ever before applied to a letter, and she put it in the bin. The second said, I did not intend to keep them at first. She looked at this for a while. It was true. It was also not an answer to the question bin. The third said, it was not for sentimental reasons. This was also true, and also not an answer, and also sounded defensive in a way she found distasteful. Bin. She sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, and looked at a 4th piece of paper and wrote, The wizarding world knew where you were sleeping. I thought someone in the family should know as well. She read it. It was 1 sentence. It was not an apology. It was not a full explanation. It was the part of the explanation she was willing to put on paper and send to an 11-year-old boy who had asked a direct question and deserved a direct answer. It said what she meant within the limits of what she could bring herself to say, which was the closest she had come to honesty in a letter in 30 years. She added, I hope the school is suiting you. She looked at this second sentence. It was not as good as the first, but it was something which was different from nothing. She folded the paper and put it in an envelope. She had been looking at the window for 2 days expecting the owl, which was why she was not startled when it appeared on the sill at 3:30, the same owl, slightly wind-blown, looking at her through the glass with the expression of something that has been commuting and does not find commuting particularly interesting. She opened the window, she addressed the envelope and tied it to the owl's leg. She double-checked the knot. The owl examined the sky, appeared to decide it was acceptable, and left. She closed the window. She stood at the sink. The shelf where the tin used to be had a small blue vase on it now, with dried lavender. She had found it in the back of the utility cupboard in December, and had meant to put it somewhere for years. She looked at it for a moment, and then went to start dinner. Harry received the letter on a Friday morning in the first week of March, when Hedwig arrived at the breakfast table and landed on the bench beside him, which was not her usual landing spot, and extended her leg with the air of someone delivering important mail. He detached the letter. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it again. The wizarding world knew where you were sleeping. I thought someone in the family should know as well. He sat with it for a moment. Around him the great hall was loud with Friday breakfast, which was the loudest breakfast of the week, because it had the weekend on the other side of it, and everyone could feel it. He folded the letter along its creases. It was not the answer he had wanted. He was not entirely sure what he had wanted. Something more, probably. Something that covered more of the question. This paragraph covered only the edge of it, the part she was prepared to give him, and he understood this in the way he had come to understand a lot of things about Petunia, that she was capable of exactly this much, and not more, and this much was not nothing. He put the letter in the inside pocket of his robes, against his chest, where he would know it was there. He gave Hedwig a piece of toast, which she ignored in favor of the water glass beside him, from which she drank with the gravity of someone who had earned it. He picked up his fork. He ate his breakfast. He thought he would keep the letter. The Hogwarts Express went south through June. Harry sat in a window seat and watched England pass, the green flatness of it, the motorway glimpsed between embankments, the backs of houses with their gardens getting smaller as the train moved toward the city and then larger again as it pulled away, which was more or less how he had been thinking since March. He had Petunia's letter in the inside pocket of his school robes. He had been carrying it there since the Friday morning she had sent it, and at a certain point in the spring he had stopped noticing its weight and had started only noticing it when he reached for something in the pocket and found it there. He had read it many more times than he strictly needed to, and he knew it by now without having to take it out. The wizarding world knew where you were sleeping. I thought someone in the family should know as well. He had decided somewhere in March that he was not going to try to get more out of the sentence than it contained. It contained what it contained. He was going to take that. The bundle of 14 letters was in his trunk, under the winter robes he no longer needed. He had taken the bundle out of the trunk twice in the spring, once to read through each letter carefully, and once to count them again for reasons he could not entirely justify, and both times he had wrapped them back up and put them back in the same place. He did not know what he was going to do with them eventually. He did not think he was going to do anything with them eventually. He thought he was going to keep them the way you keep a thing when you don't know what the thing is for, except that it proves something happened, and it is yours, and therefore you are the right person to have it. He was going back to Privet Drive. He had not found a way to feel particularly positive about this, which was not a failure of imagination so much as an honest assessment of what Privet Drive had historically been. But he was going. He had 10 months of Hogwarts behind him. 10 months of dormitory beds and floating candles and transfiguration homework and potions he had mostly not been good at, and a whole year of small accumulating evidence that he was in the right place. And it would still be in him when September came around, and he got on this train again and went north. It was not a bad position to be in, on a June afternoon, with the English countryside going by outside the window. He thought he would eat something. He had a chocolate frog in his bag. He ate the chocolate frog. He watched the sky. The train went south. Petunia had been watching the gate since 2:30, not standing at the window watching, which would have been excessive and which she had specifically decided not to do, but going about her afternoon in the normal way, which happened to take her past the kitchen window at intervals that would allow her to register a taxi, a trunk, a figure coming up the path. This was simply the awareness of someone who had set the spare room ready and was going to want to know when the evening's logistics were about to begin. She was being practical. She was near the kitchen window because the kitchen was where she spent her afternoons. These were the facts. She heard the taxi before she saw it. She went to the front door. He was on the path with his trunk, the taxi already pulling away behind him. He had grown. She did not know why. This surprised her. Children grew. It was the one reliable thing they did. But she had been carrying the image of him from July of the previous year in her head for 10 months. He was wearing his school things, which were not quite like ordinary clothes. His black hair was, as it always was, irreducibly messy, the kind of messy that occurred when someone had that particular hair and had been on a train all day and had also simply always had that hair. He had his mother's eyes. She had known this since the night he had been left on her doorstep, had known it every day of the 10 years after that, had resented the knowing with a consistency she had always counted on. She looked at him now, standing on the front path in the June evening, and she found that the resentment was still there. It had not dissolved. She had not performed some interior transformation she was not capable of performing. This was not something she intended to investigate too closely. She noted it the way she noted other things that had changed without her arranging for them to change. And she moved on. She said, "Come in. Leave your trunk for a moment." He left the trunk at the gate and came in. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She heard him go back out to the path, which was the sound of someone who had decided not to take instruction about the trunk, which was consistent with what she knew of him. He came in dragging the trunk over the threshold. She heard the bump of it on the step. She went back to the hallway. She did not know quite what made her do it. She was not a person who did things without knowing what made her do them, and she would wonder about it later in the evening and again in the days after and would not arrive at a satisfying answer. She took the handle of his trunk. She carried it to the bottom of the stairs. She set it down there at the foot of the first step, where it would be easy to take it up. She did not take it up. She was not going to take it up. But she had carried it from the doormat to the stairs, which was a distance of perhaps 6 feet, and she had done it without being asked. Harry was watching her. She could feel him watching her. She turned around. He was standing in the hallway with an expression she could not read. Not the unreadable expression he had used throughout his childhood, the careful non-expression of someone who had learned not to show things. This was genuinely unreadable, the expression of someone who had also seen something they were not quite sure how to process. He said, "Thank you for sending them." She had known he was going to say something like this. She had been preparing in the back of her mind for something like this since March, and she had not found a good answer to it, and had eventually decided that not finding a good answer was itself information about what kind of person she was, and she said, "Don't be foolish." She went back to the kitchen. She heard him pick up the trunk. She heard him on the stairs, each step deliberate, the trunk bumping behind him, and then the landing, and then the door of the smallest bedroom. She got out 2 cups. She was not sure he drank tea. She had made it for 10 years without giving him any, and was not certain of his preferences. She made 2 cups. Anyway, his room was the smallest bedroom. Had been since July 1991, had been, for less time than the other room had been. She had not been in it since she had cleaned it out for him the previous August. She heard him moving around in it now, and she thought about what he was doing up there. And then she thought about not thinking about what he was doing up there, and took her tea to the table and sat down. Harry spread the letters on the bed. The room was the smallest bedroom, and it smelled of the year of absent occupancy, faintly stale, slightly warm from the summer afternoon coming through the window, and it had a window and a door and a wardrobe and a bed. And none of these things had ever seemed remarkable before this year, and all of them seemed remarkable now. In a quiet way, he had stopped being able to set aside. He put his trunk at the foot of the bed and took out the bundle from under the winter robes and untied it and spread all 14 envelopes on the bedspread. He had done this before. He had done this in the dormitory in January, and in a small way it was the same action, The counting, the laying out, the 2 groups, the torn corner alone, the 14 envelopes together. He looked at them on his bed. In his room in the house he had come back to. He did not know what Petunia had wanted him to do with them. Her letter had said the world knew where he was sleeping, and she had thought someone in the family should know too, and he had read that as she had kept them because she could not let the knowledge be entirely unknown, and now she was passing the knowing to him. That was his reading of it. He was 11, and this was his reading, and he thought it was probably approximately right in the way that readings of brief, controlled letters by 11-year-olds were approximately right when the person who sent the letter was also being approximately honest. He looked at the torn corner, the cupboard under the stairs. He had read this address many times. He had developed a precise awareness of what it meant, which was, someone wrote it down. That was all. That was the thing that did not go away when he looked at it. Someone wrote it down, and here it was, and it had his name on it, and it was his. He was going to keep them. He did not know what keeping them was for exactly. He had not decided anything about what he was going to do with the address or the knowledge or the fact that the school that had given him everything had also documented where he had slept, without doing anything about the documentation. He was 11, and he did not have a plan for any of it. He just knew that the letters had been in Petunia's tin for 6 months, and before that they had been in the world trying to reach him, and before that they had never been his to have, and they were his now. He bundled them back up. He tied the string. He put the bundle in the drawer of the bedside table, where he would know it was there. He unpacked the rest of his trunk and put his things away in the wardrobe and put his robes in the washing pile and put his school books on the shelf, because they were here for the summer. But he was not going to stop using them, and then he thought about the tea Petunia had probably made and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Petunia stood at the sink. She had been there for perhaps 10 minutes, not washing anything, just standing in the particular way she stood when she was thinking about something she had decided not to think about directly. The cup of tea she had made for him was on the table. She heard him come in. She looked at the shelf where the tin had been. She had put a vase there in December, the blue glass vase, dried lavender, and she looked at it now as she did most mornings, registering the fact of it, the change it represented. The shelf had been the tins for 6 months. Before that, the wardrobe had been the tins for 10 years. Now the tin was in the wardrobe again, and the shelf had the vase and the 14 letters, and the torn corner were in the smallest bedroom where they belonged. She heard Harry behind her, pulling out the chair at the kitchen table, the chair he had always used, the one farthest from Vernon's, and the small sound of the teacup being picked up. She kept looking at the vase. She heard him moving around upstairs in the evenings. After that, the ordinary sounds of someone living in a room, which she had not heard from the smallest bedroom in 10 months. She heard him in the mornings, on the landing in the bathroom, on the stairs. These were new sounds and also old sounds, and she organized them into the general category of the house's sounds, which was what you did with the sounds of a house you lived in. She did not call up to him. He did not call down. She had not changed into someone who called up to him. She knew this. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself, in the kitchen, in the evenings when the house was quiet, and she was standing at the counter with the last cup of tea of the day. She was the same person she had always been, and the same person she had always been had kept 14 letters from an 11-year-old boy in a tin in a wardrobe for 6 months, and then sent them to him when he asked, and had carried his trunk 6 feet, and had said, "Don't be foolish," when he thanked her. This was all she had. She had given him all of it. Upstairs, the boy who had slept in a cupboard for 10 years was keeping now the letters that recorded it. The distance between them was the same as it had always been. That was true. It was also true that it was a different kind of same, which was not nothing, which was perhaps the most